Welcome to Interview from Mexico. I'm Laura Carlson, and I'll be your host as we look at cutting-edge issues with the men and women who know them best, here on Telesur. The case of the disappeared students of Ayotzinapa brought international attention to the serious situation of human rights in the state of Guerrero. But Guerrero has been experiencing conflict, violence, and violations of human rights for decades. On today's program of Interview from Mexico, we'll be talking to a prominent human rights leader about what's behind the crisis of human rights in the state.
Compañeros de Ayotzinapa, hoy 40, 41, 42, 43, justicia.
To talk about the crisis of human rights in the state of Guerrero, we're here with Maduro Rosales, a lawyer with the Center for Human Rights of the Mountain in Tlachinolan in the state of Guerrero. Vidulfo, thank you so much for joining us here on Interview from Mexico. Vidulfo, I wanted to start out by asking you, why is it that the state of Guerrero seems to be the epicenter of human rights violations in the entire country?
Yes, you see, it's a difficult situation. Guerrero historically has been suffering a systematic violation of human rights for many years. And I think that also the governments that have come into power haven't tried to revert the, let's say, historical violations that took place in the 60s, to the point that today these violations are being repeated. There has been no settling of accounts with the past. The violators of human rights in the 60s and 70s recall that that was when there were the worst violations, haven't been sanctioned or brought to justice. The violations of the past are being repeated.
How did these violations of human rights in the past affect what's happening today?
First, there is still pain. There are still wounds that have not healed, that have not closed and are still there. And the other is an index of impunity that is very high. This allows them to keep repeating the violations out of history. And every year, the violations of human rights become worse and worse, to the point that this year there were 43 disappeared students of Ayotzinapa. I think that this can explain a little the grave violations of human rights that are suffered here.
And what are some of the worst types of violations of human rights that you're seeing in the state today?
Look, now we are working with grave violations, such as torture of indigenous women. We're also working on extrajudicial executions of several leaders, opposition political leaders and students. And we also work with issues of land and territory, in that the mining and extractive companies are affecting indigenous people today. This is the most visible part of our work. The most visible part because there's another part of the work that Tlachinolan does of accompaniment and advising, but these are the high-impact cases.
So who are the major perpetrators of these violations against the people of Guerrero?
Well, mainly what we see is that it's the authorities on various levels. The Mexican army, the police, the officials in the justice system, the executive power and the legislative power, the whole system of government, the whole governmental apparatus in the state of Guerrero is the body that commits the most serious human rights violations. The governments commit serious violations. On the other hand, the private industries that are also coming in to extract the natural resources, but with the collusion and the support of the authorities. The authorities are the ones that allow, by way of laws and concessions, the private companies to come in the first place.
So let's talk about those one by one. First of all, the authorities. I think a lot of people could be surprised at the fact that it's the government itself that is causing this crisis of human rights within the state of Guerrero? Because, of course, the argument is that the military has been sent in and the federal police have been sent in to restore the rule of law in the state. So why is it that you're seeing the opposite?
Sí, mira, creemos nosotros que no, que hay una tradición en
Well,
Guerrero
we
de-
believe that no, that there is a tradition in Guerrero that the authorities are the ones who exercise political violence, historically, right? They are the ones to carry out the violations. For example, against the indigenous women, Valentina Rosendo Cantú and Inés Fernández Ortega. They were members of the Mexican army. The crime against the students of Ayotzinapa, it was the police, both in the year 2010 and now in 2014. Well, it's the police who are the perpetrators. It's the established powers, like the judicial power and the Congress of Guerrero, who have been unable to prosecute or sanction the perpetrators.
El Congreso de Guerrero, en el caso del 2011, quienes no han podido procesar y ni sancionar a los...
So the state apparatus, in its, entirely becomes an opponent of the victims of human rights violations. When the police carry out violations of human rights, the tribunals whose function should be to correct, right? These human rights violations are the ones who are completely negligent in really carrying out procedures and punishing those responsible. So they generate a climate of impunity, and the institution that should sanction and uphold rule of law become human rights violators themselves.
Ahí se genera toda una impunidad y se vuelven también violadores a los derechos humanos los órganos que deberían restaurar, que deberían sancionar el Estado de Derecho.
So basically you're saying that they're responsible because of impunity, because of the lack of justice. They create a climate of impunity, and also in cases like the rape and sexual torture of Valentina y Inés Ortega, Valentina Rosendo, they're actually the ones who commit these crimes.
Sí, hay
Yes, there are
diferentes
very
análisis.
different analyses, no? For example, it is believed, or based on the facts that we have, certain elements. For example, in the case of Valentina and the case of Ayotzinapa, which today are the two most serious cases in Guerrero, were carried out by members of the police. These groups are attacked intentionally, but there is also a pattern. There is a pattern of repeated violations, so there is an international purpose on the part of the government to attack these sectors, to attack the normal school of Ayotzinapa, to attack the indigenous communities.
And why?
En el caso de los pueblos indígenas, porque desde la óptica gubernamental...
In the case of the indigenous communities, because from the viewpoint of the government, in this indigenous area, where Inés Fernández Ortega and Valentina Rosendo Cantú were located, was believed to be a flashpoint of insurgency, of guerrilla activity, or that the guerrilla was operating there. We're talking about the year 2001. In the case of Ayotzinapa, it's a sector that has been protesting since many years ago. It's a student sector that protests, that goes out in the streets, but also that trains critical teachers, who are going to later join the statewide organization CETEC, join the democratic current, the CENTE. And today, they are seriously questioning the structural reforms, seriously questioning the unjust state of affairs. But they are also professors who are going to the community and then establish relationships with the communities, contribute to the awakening among the people so that later can defend themselves from injustice. And obviously, this makes the state uncomfortable, and that's why there is a systematic attack against these sectors.
I want to come back to that point and talk about the role of the state in all this after a short pause. We'll be right back. We're back talking to the lawyer, Vidulfo Rosales, about the human rights crisis in Guerrero. And we ended on an interesting point. You were talking about the role of the authorities as the perpetrators of the violations of human rights. And from what you were saying, it sounded like not only are there violations by certain authorities, but there's an intentional act of repression and intimidation involved in many of these violations. Could you explain that to us?
Sí, mira, lo que te decía anteriormente, que No son hechos aislados las violaciones.
Yes, well, like I was saying earlier, the violations of human rights are not isolated occurrences. In the first case, I was talking about Inés and Valentina Rosendo Cantú. Well, there's a strong community organization. There's an organization of the campesino people to defend their territory, to defend their natural resources in this place. But this place is identified as a focal point of insurgency, according to the logic of the government. According to the logic of the police authorities, it's identified as a hotspot for insurgency. So, for this reason, there have been a series of serious violations of human rights that have never been resolved or punished, and it got to the point finally, in the year 2001, that these two women are raped. In the case of Ayotzinapa, there were also a series of violations of their human rights in a systematic way, because they represent a sector, say, that protests with a critical position, that generates awareness, a seedbed of professors, that later, these professors will become part of the people and the communities. So there's also logic of repression that started years ago. The most visible, that became very public, was the repression of 2011, during which two students were killed, an event that went completely unpunished, and now, the 26th and 27th of September.
So your organization and you as the legal representative of the parents of the students that disappeared of Ayotzinapa, you think that it was more than just a corrupt act of the local police, that there's actually a political motive behind it?
Sí, nosotros creemos que hay forma parte de una represión
we
que ya
believe
viene
that
de
the events
varios
of
años.
Ayotzinapa form a part of a campaign of repression that has been going on for several years. It's not a coincidence. It wasn't a spontaneous or fortuitous action on the part of the police, that they just got upset at the moment and turned on them. The clearest example is that today we are reviewing the records, we're examining the evidence that exists, and we can't find a clear explanation of why, as the students are leaving at 6 in the evening, the police already have a report that they are leaving. That is, all the authorities are alerted at the moment: the Mexican Army, the Federal Police, the Ministerial Police, the State Police, which are all the security forces that converge in Iguala, Ayotzinapa, part of ongoing repression. Strangely, there is a total lack of response on the part of all these groups when the attack begins, which is at 9:30 at night until 2 in the morning. So this is a fact that stands out. It's a fact to take into consideration, to express, to point out that there was complete inaction. And how do you explain this lack of response? We ask ourselves. And we say that it's an instance of systematic repression in which the Federation is also responsible, the Mexican Army, the Federal Police, and of the authorities who were remiss in trying to prevent it.
And is this part currently being investigated?
No, it's not being investigated. Unfortunately, it's not being investigated. But it's the part that we're trying to emphasize, as representatives of the families of the disappeared. I think that soon we'll see that the experts on the commission will say.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you about too. Right now there's a committee of experts that's been sent in to investigate the case from the Inter-American Commission, in part because there's a lack of faith in the investigation that was carried out and that is practically closed by the Mexican Attorney General's office. What are they finding out, and what have you discovered working with the committee of experts so far? Of course, they haven't presented their final report yet.
Yes, well, we have high expectations that the Commission of Experts will help to demonstrate the shortcomings of the official investigation and that it will reactivate that investigation. Because today, the line is that the investigation is already over, that the absolute and historic truth has already been established, and that there's nothing else to be done. So, from the perspective of the families, well, first of all, there is still no truth.
Because this explanation that the government has given us does not take into account any political motive or repression on the part of the Iguala police, and also doesn't take into account the other aspects that we've been talking about here.
Yes, that's right. The investigation is not taking this aspect into account. Now, as I mentioned, they are already closing the investigation, even though we know that there are many gaps in it. We have to call on the Mexican army to testify. We have to open these lines of investigation.
Will have any of the military given testimony?
There have been a few meetings. A few soldiers have gone in to testify, but there is no line of investigation to go deeper and more exhaustively into what is. What was the role of the army during these hours?
And this is absolutely essential because we now know that the army was there, in fact, in the clinic when some of the wounded of Ayotzinapa were taken to the hospital, right?
Yes, there is that evidence, and there's other previous evidence on the context. The local police from Iguala who were arrested spoke about complicity between the Mexican army and the Guerreros Unidos. They talk about complicity between Mexican army and the local police.
And for our viewers, let's tell them that Guerreros Unidos is the local drug cartel, organized crime group, right?
Yeah, that's right. And as I was saying, there is evidence, proof, from statements made by the police themselves who said that there was a complicity between this armed institution and the Cocula police, the Cocula security forces, who had been arrested earlier but were inexplicably released. So there's this set of evidence that indicates to us that there should be a line of investigation opened up into the Mexican army, but today it still isn't happening. So we hope that the Commission, the group of experts of the Inter-American Commission, will open new lines of investigation, not only into the Mexican army, but also into the local politicians in the townships around Iguala, who also have some responsibility. There's evidence of their possible participation. So we say this set of additional leads would help, we believe, to explore other lines of investigation, other sets of hypotheses, of truths. Because for us, the government's line of investigation, its hypothesis of the dumping Cocula, is a dead end.
Well, that's very dramatic.
Yes, it can no longer offer the truth. There's nothing more to be found there. And today, we still don't know what happened to the students. The hypothesis of the government that the students were incinerated has a lot of major contradictions. Also, soon, the investigators, the group of forensics experts from Argentina, are also going to announce an opinion about the facts of the case and the mechanism of the garbage dump in Cocula. We hope this will chip holes in the official version.
We'll be waiting to see what the committee says in its report, which will be coming out soon, I think. We'll go to another short pause and be back in just a moment. We're here talking to the lawyer, Vidulfo Rosales, about human rights in Guerrero, and particularly the case of Ayotzinapa. But Vidulfo, now I wanted to turn to your story. How did you end up being a lawyer, a defender of human rights in Tlapa, Guerrero, in the Centro Tlachinolan?
Well, the poverty that we grew up with, the poverty we experienced in that area, which, as you know, and all the Mexicans know, is the poorest region of the country. I'm from that area, from the High Sierra region. I'm from a town called Totomixtlahuaca, that it's in the high part of the Tlapa mountain, about 3 hours from the bottom of the mountain. And that helped me to get to work there with the Tlachinolan Center for Human Rights. These circumstances that we lived with, this sea of injustices that we experienced from the time we were born, and that the people there still have no face, inspired us, as students, to maintain a sort of social concern. And then later, we channeled this concern into the defense of human rights.
And we often focus on poverty as a contributing factor to the violation of human rights, like the violence, the murders, and the attacks. But poverty itself is a violation of human rights, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. It is a systematic violation through which people are made vulnerable. They don't have access to education, to health services. They don't have the means to travel to the centers of justice to file charges. Poverty is a systematic violation of human rights. Based on this, there are a lot of things. the abandonment of the indigenous peoples, marginalization. All of these are obstacles to full human development.
And what kinds of violations did you experience personally in your community?
Lots of serious violations. For example, when I can tell you that when I finished high school, we still didn't have electricity in my community, or road. We had to walk for hours. When I went to high school, we're talking about the 90s. I went to high school in 90 and 91. I had to walk for hours to get a car and go to high school. My community had no electricity. In the rainy season, with all the water, the limited roads that there were would be totally destroyed, so I would have to walk twice as far. These were circumstances, just for starters. There was also no access to healthcare, and education was basic. We had to be on the road hours to get to high school, not to mention the university.
Well, we have very little time, unfortunately, left in the program, and I wanted to finish by asking you the crisis of human rights in the state of Guerrero. Is it the exception or the rule?
I think it's a symptom of what is going on all over the country. I don't think that the state of Guerrero is an exception or an island. What happens there happens in many states of the Republic. All the violence that happens there also happens in Veracruz, also happens in Michoacán, Oaxaca, and Chiapas. The ancestral poverty that people living with Guerrero, people also live within other states. The events of Ayotzinapa, things like that had been occurring for a long time. Maybe not with these dimensions, but since the 60s, we can trace the establishment of historic dates of tragedies, of massacres, no?
And every time that goes unpunished, it creates more probability that it'll happen again.
Exactly. It's like I said when we started talking. It gets repeated, and each time it gets worse. So we, who are from Guerrero, believe that when the transition happened, the supposed political transitions when the PRD took power in Guerrero, we thought it would be the beginning of maybe a different era, right? Like happened here in Mexico City. We thought we were on the verge of a change. There was the expectation of a possible change, or that some things would move around, but nothing changed. On December 12th, we saw again, with great sadness, the bodies of 2 rural school students bloodied on the highway, and that made us sad and worried again, and we knew things were the same. And now Iguala, and we are still in the basement of injustice and marginalization. But we're not saying that because of this, Guerrero is the exception. What happens there also happens in a lot of other places. Many are in the same situation, but there is a situation that is very evident in Guerrero for the reasons I was telling you.
Well, in this context, it's so important to have defenders of human rights like the Center Tlachinolan. Thanks so much for being with us here on Interview from Mexico. And thank you. I'm Laura Carlson. We'll be back next week on Interview from Mexico.